So, this weekend saw the release of Jon Favreau's The Mandalorian and Grogu, the first theatrical Star Wars film released in almost 7 years, and, well...
It's worse than I thought.
It is a nothing burger of a film, bereft of any substance or purpose, and unburdened by anything resembling a perspective. It is a bunch of familiar iconography smooshed together for 2 hours and 10 minutes without any meaning or intent beyond the desire to make the shareholders happy. It is the apotheosis of content as a creative philosophy unto itself. It is proof that when you shoot 4 episodes of television with an IMAX camera, they are still 4 episodes of television. It is, for lack of a better word, content to be content. So, this week we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the emptiness at the heart of the film. We're going to talk about the filmography of director Jon Favreau and how The Mandalorian and Grogu feels like the culmination of his work. And finally, we're going to talk about the cynicism and the hollowness of what might be termed post-human cinema. This will involve talking about things that happen in the film, but I hesitate to call them spoilers because that would imply that anything meaningful actually happens in those 2 hours and 10 minutes. Still, consider yourself warned. With that in mind, punch it. There is a literal emptiness at the heart of Jon Favreau's The Mandalorian and Grogu, a film where dozens of minutes can pass without anything resembling a human face appearing on screen. The most interesting segment of the film comes in the second half, after bounty hunter Din Djarin has been abducted by the silent, computer-generated goon Embo, who works on behalf of the also computer-generated Hutt twins. Din's puppet ward, Grogu, leads an expedition of puppet Anzelians, or Babu's Frick if you will, on a mission to rescue his surrogate father. After Din is poisoned by the Hutt's pet monster, Grogu has to tend to him and survive in the wilderness. This is a technically impressive sequence. In some ways, it recalls the work of the Jim Henson studio on films like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. The puppets are undeniably visually interesting. In a film that feels largely digital with environments simulated by the volume, and computer-generated characters like Din's pilot Garazeb Zeb Oralios, the puppets provide a sense of tactility and tangibility. Although they're never entirely realistic or verisimilitudinous, they look like they have weight and mass. This is the most interesting thing about The Mandalorian and Grogu as a film, outside of the specific cultural context of having to transition Star Wars back to theaters from streaming. It is a film with very few human faces in it. Now, the counterpoint to that would be that there are lots of films without human faces in them. Animation is a medium unto itself. We've already mentioned the Henson puppets. However, there is something different here. Animation allows for exaggerated, anthropomorphized emotional expression that doesn't always translate into pseudo-live action, as the Disney remakes have demonstrated time and time again. And the most successful of the Muppet films rely heavily on the human co-stars, pairing the puppets with actors like Tim Curry or Michael Caine. Even the Muppet shows are built around the gimmick of a central human host. Something like the recent Project Hail Mary, which features incredible puppetry, relies heavily on human co-star Ryan Gosling to do a lot of the emotional heavy lifting. The difference with The Mandalorian and Grogu is that this is a clear attempt to create something approximating live-action cinema without humanity. It is instead perfectly controlled puppets on perfectly created sound stages. It is interchangeable human bodies with their faces obscured. It is unreality presenting itself as something akin to reality. It is what philosopher Randy Lace called cinema of simulation, but we'll circle back to that. Now, a lot of the authorial intent of The Mandalorian and Grogu can be traced to producer, co-writer, and hat enthusiast Dave Filoni. The film is populated with references to characters and concepts drawn from the expanded universe. The film's third lead, Rhoda the Hutt, who asked the question, "What if Jabba had roid rage?" appeared in the Clone Wars theatrical film, another movie that felt like 4 episodes of a show stitched together and just shoved into cinema because why the hell not? Embo was a character on Filoni's Clone Wars television show. Zeb was established in Filoni's Rebels. And in typical Filoni fashion, the audience is not given any reason to care for these characters beyond the assumption that they recognize them from pre-existing Star Wars properties. Of the film's villains, the first half's primary antagonist, Johnny Coyne as, well...
Commander Coyne.
Yeah, first idea, best idea, huh, guys? Was introduced during an exposition-laden scene in The Spies, the penultimate episode of The Mandalorian. And look, no disrespect to Johnny Coyne, But that scene also had like Brian Gleason and Xander Berkeley in it, and you picked that guy? Brian Gleason had a small but crucial role in Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread. Xander Berkeley has a long and distinguished career as a character actor, popping in memorable but small roles in films like Michael Mann's Heat. These might not be actors capable of carrying a film costing several $100 million as the primary villain, but they could certainly carry the first act of one as a decoy antagonist. But we're stuck with
Commander Coin.
And the Hutt twins had previously appeared as secondary antagonists in the Book of Boba Fett, a show that you definitely want viewers to be thinking about while watching your movie. And look, whatever George Lucas's myriad flaws as a storyteller might be, he did basically understand that Jabba the Hutt was kind of an Act 1 villain, while the Mandalorian and Grogu finds Favreau and Filoni literally doubling down. All of this pointless lore referencing fan service is par for the course for how Filoni approaches Star Wars, most obviously in his own Ahsoka series. And look, there's a separate video to be made about how depressing it is that Filoni has become the heir to the throne at Lucasfilm. And we can just look forward to the franchise being like this going forward. However, this emphasis on puppets feels more in line with Favreau's current directorial and creative impulses. So let's give Favreau the benefit of the doubt here, and let's talk about The Mandalorian and Grogu as an auteurist text, as an example of the cinema of Jon Favreau. Favreau has changed a lot over his extended career. He emerged as a darling of the independent film scene. He wrote and starred in Swingers, directed by Doug Liman and co-starring Vince Vaughn. He would also co-star with Vaughn in Made, the movie that he wrote, starred in, and directed. These were very grounded buddy comedies. To a 90s kid, Favreau will always exist in that mode, typified by his charming guest spot in Friends as Monica's sweet but oblivious billionaire boyfriend. From those humble beginnings, Favreau quickly pivoted into more special effects-driven work. Elf was a family comedy with an endearingly simple premise, the idea of a human raised as one of Santa's elves, that relied heavily on the use of forced perspective and even stop motion. Favreau followed Elf with the largely forgotten Zathura: A Space Adventure, a standalone follow-up to Jumanji that Favreau himself likened in publicity to Star Wars. For Favreau, working with models and with practical effects was a large part of the appeal of doing Zathura.
I'm a bit of a nostalgic filmmaker, so working on with practical effects just makes it more fun for me. And I find that the challenges of presenting the crew with the mission statement of, trying to work with practical effects makes it from much more collaborative and creative experience. It's so fun to actually shoot real spaceships or have a real robot running around the set or real Zorgons built by Stan Winston.
After that, he started the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Iron Man, a movie that carried over some of Favreau's independent sensibility. The finished film was largely improvised by Favreau with star Robert Downey Jr., an experience that was initially frustrating to co-star Jeff Bridges.
It drove me absolutely crazy until I made a slight adjustment in my brain, and that adjustment was, Jeff, you're making a $200 million student film. Just relax and have fun.
Scrambling to put together a blockbuster through improv and with an indie sensibility, Favreau really did build cinema's most successful shared universe
in a cave! With a box of scraps!
However, Favreau's loose, indie, improvisational approach seemed to reach breaking point with the production of Iron Man 2, a film in which Favreau compared his experience to that of El Cid, quote, strapped onto his horse by his men and sent into battle dead. Although Favreau has drifted away from the creative side of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he remained on screen in the role of Happy Hogan. Behind the camera, he pivoted away from the shared universe with another big effects-driven blockbuster, Cowboys and Aliens, starring Harrison Ford and Daniel Craig. However, following the critical and commercial disappointment of that attempt at a big studio blockbuster, Favreau retreated to the relative modesty of Chef, a film more in line with his earlier work like Swingers or Made. In the parlance of Iron Man, Favreau went back to the cave. It is possible, in fact it's almost inevitable, to read Chef as semi-autobiographical. Favreau casts himself as a food truck owner content to make more modest and artisanal snacks in what feels like a statement of artistic humbleness.
I think we take it back to something simple. Let me see if I got something to say anymore. I don't even know.
It's also hard not to read some level of personal fantasy into this, with Favreau casting Scarlett Johansson as his character's new girlfriend, Sofia Vergara as his character's ex-wife, and Robert Downey Jr. as his ex-wife's super cool new other ex-husband. At the time, Chef seemed like a return to form, Favreau reconnecting with his indie roots, rebuilding himself, well,
in a cave with a box of scraps.
In hindsight, though, it feels more like an exorcism. Favreau shedding the last vestiges of the filmmaker that he was, the filmmaker interested in human emotions, human stories, and even human faces, before moving on to the next stage of his career. It is very telling that Favreau talks about Chef not as a movie about the man that he was, but as about the man that he might have been had things been different.
Yeah, Chef's definitely the most personal since Swingers. Autobiographical is a tricky term. I don't know if it's autobiographical because it's more of who I could have been had I lived my life differently.
Still, Favreau could not resist the siren call of the blockbuster. He went on to direct the computer-generated remakes of both The Jungle Book and The Lion King for Disney. These were movies that approximated live action, but which featured few if any human faces. For most of its runtime, The Jungle Book features a single human character. The Lion King offers photorealistic footage of animals without a single recognizable human feature in sight. These were massive successes. The Jungle Book made $966 million worldwide, while The Lion King grossed $1.6 billion, substantially passing the lifetime gross of The Rise of Skywalker, the Star Wars film that was released in theaters that year.
Baby, you are so money and you don't even know it.
At this point, Favreau shifted into managing the Star Wars brand during its pivot to streaming, becoming showrunner on The Mandalorian. Favreau was basically the auteur of The Mandalorian. If directors are the auteur of film, writers tend to be the auteur of television. Favreau has a writing credit on 20 of the show's 24 episodes. He also has a writing credit on all 7 episodes of the Book of Boba Fett, but maybe you want to take less credit for that one. While he did not direct the bulk of the show, he was the key creative force. And while Favreau clearly has a love of Hollywood history and of Star Wars as a property, with the show including visual references to the films of the 70s and 80s like Jaws, Alien, and even Sorcerer, basically serving to play Star Wars in the larger cultural context of its release in the mid to late 70s. Although it's also nice that Bryce Dallas Howard got to throw in a reference to her father's Apollo 13. A lot of Favreau's work on The Mandalorian tended towards the technical. Much was made, for example, of the show's early adoption of the technology known as the volume, to render convincing backdrops on a soundstage, allowing the crew to film on a set and largely bypass location shooting. With all due respect to Pedro Pascal, the show's true breakout was an animatronic puppet so incredibly charming that co-star and art house director Werner Herzog was brought to tears by it.
Did you see the Baby Yoda that was revealed in the pilot yet?
I have seen it on the set. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreakingly beautiful, and it made you cry when you saw it.
It can often feel like the puppet has been doing more press for The Mandalorian and Grogu than Pascal himself. He certainly spent more time on set. Now, Favreau comes across as a very likable person.
Yeah, he puts himself in his own movies, but you don't mind because he seems like the kind of guy who'd help you move if you asked him.
Everybody likes him. Well, almost everybody.
Jon Favreau tried to steal my ideas. Swingers? He can suck my dick. That swings too.
Favreau's a really good interview subject, talking honestly and frankly about the subjects that interest him, demonstrating a thoughtfulness and consideration about the technical aspects of filmmaking. A lot of Favreau's press around The Mandalorian and Grogu has been engaged with technical issues like artificial intelligence.
Do you treat generative AI the same way you treat rig removal for wire shots, or segmentation when you want to separate a subject from a background? So I think that there's a whole hierarchy of different technologies that we have to have a conversation about, and then have transparency as to what tools we're using so that the audience understands what they're buying.
It really does feel like this mechanical dimension of movie production is what interests Favreau as a filmmaker, particularly at this stage of his career, to the exclusion of organic elements like human beings or actors. This is not to suggest that Favreau is inauthentic or anything like that. He clearly cares about the things that interest him, like his love of cooking. It's honestly charming how much of the publicity for The Mandalorian and Grogu is built around Favreau teaming up with celebrity chefs like Jamie Oliver or Roy Choi. In fact, the closest that The Mandalorian and Grogu comes to offering an auteurist statement from Jon Favreau may be in the 2 scenes where the Mandalorian visits a food truck operated by a CGI Martin Scorsese.
I'll take a flat meat fry for the little one.
Got it. Okay, got it.
However, there is perhaps something to this. Favreau can occasionally feel like an artist more concerned with the mechanics of a meal's construction than with the resulting meal itself. Since Chef, it feels like Favreau has grown less and less interested in working with human faces. In hindsight, It makes Iron Man feel like something of a thesis statement for the director. The story of a human being literally encased in a cold mechanical shell, the recognizable human form swallowed whole by computer-generated imagery. This explains a lot about The Mandalorian and Grogu, a film which works very hard to push any recognizably human elements into the background. The film's central character, Din Djarin, spends all but about 10 minutes of the movie with a helmet covering his face, making him less a person than a posable action figure. It is no wonder that there have been rumors about how much or how little time Pedro Pascal spends on set, and how much of the show was outsourced to his stand-ins.
There was an extended amount of experimentation, like being in the suit for a lot of it. But now we've figured it out. It's super cool, and amazingly gave me the opportunity to be able to go and do something else.
Pascal is basically playing a voiceover role in live action. One of his stand-ins, Brendan Wayne, grandson of legendary cowboy actor John Wayne, has openly talked about how frustrating it is that his work on the show, in which he functionally plays the lead character, is not widely recognized as a performance.
When it bothers me is when I'm trying to get a job and they're like, "You're a stud guy." And I'm like, "Oh, fuck you."
Yeah.
Okay. Like those are the things. Like, how do you allow that to happen to another artist? Like,
it is worth acknowledging that the film's closing credits do offer prominent placement to Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder as the physical performers playing Mando. However, the physical performers were excluded from the various actors' roundtables included in the supplemental material for the show, and for the first 2 seasons, they were credited simply as doubles. Even for the film itself, the press cycle has made very little effort to include the physical performers who are on set day after day playing the Mandalorian, instead foregrounding a puppet and what is effectively a voice performer with a couple minutes cameo in the film itself. It's worth stressing here that the physical performers playing Mando and all the craftspeople involved in realizing Grogu do incredible work. This is, after all, a pro-Grogu show. We are pro-Gu here. But it's not the physical performers or the puppeteers who get to sit down and do publicity interviews with Jon Favreau or Sigourney Weaver promoting the movie. And sure, one can talk about the franchise's historical marginalization of David Prowse, who provided the physical performance of Darth Vader in the original trilogy. But Vader wasn't the lead character of those movies, and more than that, one would hope that the industry has come on in some ways in the nearly 50 years since then. The broader point is that Favreau is just largely disinterested in his human actors. Oscar nominee and science fiction icon Sigourney Weaver shows up to slot into an exposition role that could largely have been given to Mandalorian recurring guest star Paul Sun-Hyung Lee. Legendary director Martin Scorsese has a 2-scene cameo as the voice of a computer-generated creature. Shelley Henderson returns as a voice of the Anzelians. Jeremy Allen White voices a swole computer-generated slug monster. The closest that The Mandalorian and Grogu comes to feeling alive behind the camera is during those extended sequences where Favreau doesn't even have to pretend to be interested in human performers, whether actors or stunt doubles, and could just live among his puppets on his digitally created soundstage. To be frank, it is certainly far more interesting than endless references to Rebels, or the Clone Wars, or the Book of Boba Fett. Grogu wandering through pipes and swamps seems to genuinely engage Favreau as a filmmaker. And you know what? Good for him. Appropriately enough, there is something almost Lucasian about this. Like George Lucas, there's a sense of Jon Favreau as a middle-aged man getting lost among his toys, less interested in the human stuff around them. Harrison Ford has talked fairly candidly about the challenges of being an actor on a George Lucas movie.
I did say, George, you can type this shit, but you cannot say it. Move your mouth while you're typing and see if you can say it.
For Lucas, particularly in his later years, it was digital imagery and filmmaking. For Favreau, it is puppets and models. The Mandalorian and Grogu feels like a version of Attack of the Clones that has been created entirely by committee and focus group to hell and back, shorn of anything remotely resembling a perspective. At times, it feels like Attack of the Clones if it were made by a safe pair of hands. What if a famously, interestingly, bizarrely bad movie were just a boring bad movie? The Mandalorian and Grogu dares to ask, what if Attack of the Clones were more practical, but somehow less human? While Lucas certainly got lost among his toys in his later years working on Star Wars, constantly tinkering with the older movies and pushing the prequels into the uncanny valley, Lucas had interests beyond the technical. Lucas was never a great writer or director of characters, actors, or dialogue.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
but he had a curiosity about the larger world. The original trilogy, for example, was very overtly Lucas meditating on the legacy of the Vietnam War.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
The original Star Wars is the tale of a young farmer who is radicalized into taking up arms after his family are effectively napalmed by an imperial power.
You look at the situation now, where America is so proud of being the biggest economy, the most powerful military force on the planet. It's become the empire from the perspective of a lot of people around the world.
It was the empire during the Vietnam War.
His prequel trilogy was a clumsy and misshapen epic about how democracies die.
With thunderous applause.
And it had meaningful things to say about the world in which it existed.
Star Wars has got a very, very elaborate social, emotional, political context that it rests in.
For all that Lucas seemed disinterested in working with actors, and for all that we think of Star Wars as a franchise populated by puppets, costumes, and special effects, as typified by the cantina scene, the best moments of Lucas's Star Wars came from actors like Harrison Ford or even Ewan McGregor managing to break through with raw emotion. In Lucas's Star Wars, that emotion could occasionally seem like an accident, but he understood it and he leaned into it. A large part of why we connect to these movies emotionally is due to the humanity and the faces of those involved. In contrast, Favreau has instead constructed a hermetically sealed universe where there is no chance of that humanity bleeding in at all. Consider the actual Star War that is depicted in The Mandalorian and Grogu. The film evokes the imagery of American foreign wars.
Commander Coin
is identified using an obvious reference to the most wanted Iraqi playing cards.
Our missing ace of spades.
Cards that were issued to coalition soldiers during the Iraq War to help identify high-value targets. However, the film has nothing to say about that conflict or its legacy. At the climax of The Mandalorian and Grogu, after he's killed the Hutt twins, Mando calls in a heroic and triumphant airstrike on the palace, which is presumably filled with slaves, innocent baby Hutts, and also droids that the series has been a bit wishy-washy about the sentience of. The sequence plays out with another of Favreau's overt homages to the 70s cinema that emerged parallel to Star Wars, this time explicitly evoking Apocalypse Now, which famously was a movie that Lucas had developed with John Milius and Francis Ford Coppola, but which Coppola would go on to direct himself, with Lucas channeling a lot of his ideas for his version of Apocalypse Now into what became Star Wars. Like Lucas's original Star Wars, Apocalypse Now is both a Vietnam movie and a dark fairy tale about America as an imperial power. It makes sense for Favreau to draw from Apocalypse Now as a point of reference. But that imagery is divorced from any meaning, context, or commentary. It takes the cynicism and skepticism of Apocalypse Now, a movie about the meaninglessness and the horror of these sorts of eternal wars, and plays it as a triumphant fist-pumping victory for our heroes over hordes of anonymous, faceless others, slugs and robots. Nothing means anything here. This is the biggest difference between Lucas and Favreau, and why Favreau is both a much less interesting and a much safer choice to act as the steward of the franchise in the Disney age. Favreau doesn't seem to care about having anything to say. He doesn't seem to have any interest in the world outside of his studio. He's boasted that his greatest accomplishment with The Mandalorian and Grogu is taking a franchise that has offered scale by shooting around the world in places like Tunisia, Skellig Michael, and the Scottish Highlands to bring character to a galaxy far, far away, and shot all of his movie on Los Angeles sound stages.
I'd like to thank the California Film Commission and allowing us to have a tax incentive here and allowing this to be the first Star Wars movie to ever be made in Los Angeles.
Which is great for the shareholders, but less so for the movie. It makes this galaxy far, far away feel like a collector's edition toy stored inside a display case. It makes the universe seem smaller and more incestuous, like two gigantic space slugs who seem to sleep together 69ing. Favreau is a creative talent unburdened by anything as gauche as a point of view. It is impossible to imagine Favreau ever resisting a studio note. In some ways, The Mandalorian and Grogu feels like a clumsy and less competently executed version of what might be termed post-human cinema, as crafted by director Joseph Kosinski. Kosinski studied mechanical engineering and architecture, and his films are often preoccupied with human beings literally and figuratively trapped in larger inhuman machinery, whether the computer systems of Tron Legacy, the carceral system in Spiderhead, or the Tom Cruise industrial complex in Oblivion. Many of Kosinski's films are about human beings trying to assert their value within these systems. These cold, immaculately designed, hermetically sealed worlds. This is true even in Kosinski's more ostensibly grounded movies. In Top Gun Maverick, Pete Maverick Mitchell is introduced facing the prospect of being replaced by drones.
These planes you've been testing, Captain. One day, sooner than later, they won't need pilots at all.
In F1 the movie, Sonny Hayes has to figure out how to integrate himself into the design and engineering-orientated mechanisms of a modern Formula One team. Hayes himself is part industrialized machine, his body literally held together by metal pins. I thought about Kosinski a lot while watching The Mandalorian and Grogu. It is a film that approximates the look and feel of a live-action movie, but with no room for any humanity within it. However, while Kosinski's films are anxious about this displacement of human beings within these cold and sterile systems, Favreau seems to have gone all in on it. It is a little unsettling at a time when actors find themselves struggling to survive in the industry, subject to replacement by artificial intelligence or CGI or any number of other threats. The original Star Wars was famously a huge vehicle for toys and merchandising, but those toys existed downstream of the films themselves. Favreau completely abolishes any delineation between the film and the mass-market products that it sells. An early sequence in The Mandalorian and Grogu involves Favreau narrativizing a background chess game from the original Star Wars, turning a toy within the original movie into the movie itself. This is perhaps what The Mandalorian and Grogu has to say about the modern world. It feels appropriate that the film emerges from the Walt Disney Corporation, the major studio that has been most eager to work with generative artificial intelligence.
AI, to Bob's point, is here, and it's something that we're embracing, and you're seeing it supercharge these creatives in amazing ways. And they've embraced artificial intelligence,
which was most openly hostile to creatives during the recent writers and actors strikes.
So they're not being realistic?
No, they're not.
Why not?
I can't answer that question.
And which is most eager to create a conveyor belt system to convert its films and shows into mass market, easily reproducible experiences like theme park rides and cruises. This is the appeal of this post-human cinema to Disney. It is very telling that the elements that Jon Favreau employs in the production of The Mandalorian and Grogu, the contained sets, the animatronic puppets, the full-body performers whose faces are hidden behind masks as a celebrity's voice plays over their actions, are all elements that can be mass-produced and replicated in hyper-real experiences like theme parks. The removal of any human element from this world is not accidental. It is not even undesirable. The emphasis on Din Djarin's mask makes it easier to hire a more cost-effective and replaceable performer to show up on set, or to integrate the character into theme park or cruise experiences. It could even be Pedro Pascal under there. I mean, it's probably not unless you're an influencer who's been invited there to promote the movie, but it could be. Concealing his face makes it easier to market and merchandise the character without worrying about Pedro Pascal's likeness or image rights. It also allows the company to fold the character into any generative artificial intelligence plans without consulting the performer in question. Hell, you can buy your own Grogu and take him home with you. This is the construction of a mass media franchise in its purest and most ideal form, stripped of any personality or any humanness. To get back to that point about the cinema of simulation that we raised half an hour ago, French philosopher Jean Baudrillard argued that the true function of Disneyland was not to convince visitors that it was reality, but to reinforce the belief in a larger reality outside it. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, when in fact, all of Los Angeles and the Americas surrounding it are no longer real, but of the order of the hyper-real and of simulation. In stripping itself of any vestige of humanity, The Mandalorian and Grogu does something similar. It is a film built with toys and posable action figures, not with the intention of making the world within it seem more tactile or tangible, but to make the mass-market products and the consumable experiences around it more authentic. The experience that you have on your Disney cruise or at your Disney theme park or in your Disney hotel is as real as the images captured on screen here. That is accomplished by shortening these images of any distinctive individual identities, of rendering it all anonymous and interchangeable, all to help Disney make just a little bit more
coin
on it all by making it all
in a cave
with a box of toys. This, ultimately, is the reality of The Mandalorian and Grogu. The film is not only set in a galaxy far, far away, but in one that has been stripped of anything remotely resembling humanity. This is, in fact, not the way. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.